So we've got our three task force members are here today that will be speaking to you. And I was asked to make just a few background remarks about the task force, how they operated, and what some of the results were. And they'll talk about the specifics for you. We do have a slideshow that'll be up there. So for those of you, if you want to turn around and look at it. Oh boy, here we go. Let's see. There it is. Good. So after a few brief remarks, we'll be going through the task force report, looking at what they recommended for changes to our buildings, changes to our transportation system, how we can generate more renewable energy, and ultimately some comments about how we fund and make this whole thing happen. As Jane said, my team helped with the facilitation of the meetings, but also with a lot of the data analysis that was done and with the final report preparation. So there was a plan for the city of Bellingham, and Claire will go through more of the details of the history here, but the plan was updated in 2018. And as soon as that plan was presented to City Council, there were people from the community looked at that and they said, you know what, it doesn't go far enough and doesn't go fast enough. And so the council reconsidered where they were with their plan process and decided to put a resolution forward which had these ambitions associated with them. First of all, they wanted to see if the city could meet 100% renewable energy for all the city's municipal facilities by 2030. And at the same time, to see if they could reach 100% renewable energy in the power supply to all of us in the community by 2030. And then finally, the big stretch, which would be all heating and transportation, would be renewable energy by 2035. So the resolution also had some directives on how to do the work, and a couple of those are indicated right here. They told us that they basically wanted us to look at what they called a triple bottom line plus technological evaluation, which meant we had to look at the social, the environmental, the financial, and the technical aspects of every recommendation that was put forward. And then we had to identify whether there were additional analyses needed for many of the recommendations. So the task force was made up of 9 people that were selected from the community. They were from an amazing talent pool, and I think you'll see some of that as evidence today. And they had held 16 meetings between around fall of 2018 and the early part or mid part of November. They had probably put 1,000 hours of volunteer time into the process. We had lots of input from people within the community as well as within the industry as a whole, pertaining to energy generation or to building conservation and technology, that type of thing. We also had work groups, so we had the main task force, but then we had 3 work groups and a 4th group that did a lot of data analysis. And those work groups then dove into the real detailed aspects of buildings, transportation and land use, and energy generation or energy supply. And then, as I said, we did a big analysis taking all the recommendations, and then we projected forward what the total greenhouse gas emissions would look like in the city if all of the different recommendations were implemented. So all the meetings were open to the public. Because we could only meet for 2 or 2.5 hours at a time, we had kind of a limited public comment period, but we did take public comment at each meeting, and we had an opportunity for people to provide public comment online, which was shared with all the task force members. You can see there, if you go on to the website for the task force, you can find where the comments were provided. And so that was an important part for us to maintain that. Just in terms of last comments here before I turn it over to folks, the report provides a wide range of ideas being implemented, many of the ideas of which are being implemented by communities all over the world. So we weren't like looking for too many things that were not already being done by other people. We tried to pull all that together and see what would potentially be feasible for our community in an effort to reduce the impact of greenhouse gases and to put the city on more of a healthy, sustainable, and resilient path for the future. So what you'll hear today are the ideas, and I think Claire will probably explain a little bit about the process forward, but this is really like a starting point in this process. These were ideas that were generated, they were presented to the council to address the council's directives on those 100% renewable energy goals. And now starts the policy analysis within the city council and the community process of working through which kinds of recommendations can be implemented on what kind of a timeline. So with that, I'll introduce our speakers today. On your far right is Clare Fogelsong. He's with the city of Bellingham. He was staff, one of 3 staff from the city who were involved in the process. And while I'm at it, where's Renee? Where are you? Way over there. Stand up, Renee. Renee's also from Public Works. She was involved from a staff level. And Mark Gardner is a policy person for the city council. Those were the 3 staff for the city that helped with this process. In the middle is Erin McDade. She's buildings person extraordinaire. She works for an organization called Architecture 2030, who is working with the 12, including Bellingham, 13 of the most progressive communities in the United States on all things that have to do with improving the efficiency and the livability of buildings around the United States. And on my left right here is Rick Nicholson. He worked, how many years for WTA? Rick worked 30 years for WTA, and so he was part of our transportation-focused work group and had a lot of interesting insights to share about that, and I'm sure you'll see and hear more of those now. So I'm going to turn the mouse over to Claire, and we'll kick things off.
Does this work? Okay, good. I'd like to start off with a brief history of where what the city's been doing about climate. This slide up here shows that in 2005, we joined some national organizations and committed to, the council and the mayor committed to climate action for the city. 2007, we passed the first climate action plan for the city. And since 2007, we've been implementing that plan. We've done another inventory of our emissions in 2015. And some of the actions we've taken in that interim have been to upgrade city buildings, the energy efficiency of city buildings. We've been purchasing electric vehicles for the city fleet. We've purchased 100% renewable energy since 2009 for the city municipal electricity use, and replaced all of our street lights. We've been working on implementing our pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure plan, and the list goes on. The city has been doing a lot of climate response actions since 2007. We're now at we were at 2018. In 2018, the council accepted the revision to the climate action plan, the 2018 revision. And like David said, during that process, it was recognized that perhaps we can expedite some of the tasks, some of the progress we could make. And that was that ended in the resolution that set the climate action task force in play. Oh, so I'm in charge of this too, right? Okay. One other thing, and we did have on the very bottom there, you can see that we also in 2019 we started our climate action education All In for Climate Action program, and Riley Grant, who's sitting here in front and who didn't get introduced, is one of our team, and if she would stand up and just take a bow, that'd be great. So moving on. Oh, good. So this is a table from our 2018 Climate Action Plan, and I want to keep reiterating that we have a Climate Action Plan in place. The recommendations are the next phase of our response to climate crisis. This is a unreadable table probably for most of you. It just simply illustrates that we did have in our Climate Action Plan update, we separated out emissions between municipal and community, and we did have targets, 100% renewable by 2050 for municipal and 85% renewable by 2050 for community emissions. And then, as David pointed out, the council put forward some aspirations to see if we could meet those goals faster. And okay, I'll get used to this. So this is reiterates sort of where we're coming from, but it also shows where we're going. And the important part of this is we received the recommendations in December of 2019. The council accepted those recommendations in as much as they took them under their consideration, and they'll be deliberating on how to proceed with those recommendations for the next bit. And that's where we're at. That's where we are here now. The recommendations are fairly unique. Some of them are brand new. We hadn't considered them in the original plan. And so it's going to take time to fulfill the obligation of a complete feasibility study. Are they socially equitable? Are they technically doable? And can we afford them? This is a graph from the 2018 plan, and what it does is it illustrates that you can see barely on the right-hand side there's transportation, and it's a big chunk of the emissions graph, the sources. And then on the left-hand side, you have residential and commercial buildings, and you can see that that's also a big chunk of the emissions sources. What's down there at the bottom are industrial energy sources. But this graph illustrates why the task force focused on transportation and buildings as well as energy supply for their work. So presenters already did that. So Erin, you're next.
Awesome. Thanks, Claire. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. Thanks for the invite from the City Club. So just quickly to explain a little bit of why I am here and why I did this work for the city. As David alluded to, I work for the organization Architecture 2030. I'm a senior program director, and I have a master's degree in architecture, and I've been working on this intersection of the building sector and climate for over a decade now. And one of the things that I've been lucky enough to do through Architecture 2030, we really work globally. Our mission is to fully decarbonize the global building sector as a solution to the climate crisis. And again, as David alluded to, I've been lucky enough to work with 13 other cities in the US to develop decarbonization policy roadmaps using a very specific data-driven methodology. And so I was really excited for this opportunity to volunteer on the task force because I was able to apply that work and that accepted data-driven methodology to the analysis here to help our city develop this decarbonization roadmap for the building sector. And so as Claire just showed on that graph, if you combine the commercial and the residential emissions within our city, which are the building sector emissions, it is the biggest chunk of the pie. And so if we are going to address climate change within our city, then those two pieces need to be addressed. And interestingly, the urban environment and buildings are actually the biggest chunk of emissions globally as well. So this is a global problem, but again, the building sector is a potential critical solution. And so anything we do in Bellingham to lead on that and establish pathways on that will just be able to help the entire world address this. And so within our city, the key data points that we use to help us develop our recommendations came from, like I said, that very robust analysis. And that analysis included a building by building level assessment of every single building in the city, looking at the use type, the size, the energy consumption, the emissions, the fuel split within each of those buildings, so how much natural gas versus electricity. We took that, aggregated all of that to get a snapshot of where we are today, and then projected that out to 2035 and to 2050, which were some of our key target years, to see how the building sector might change in a business as usual scenario. So in case we don't take any action on this, which of course we won't do. So from that, we took a few critical charts. And all of these charts, again, are that business as usual scenario. So they show that, and we're missing some of the labels here, but they show that in 2035, our target year, if we don't do anything at all, then 17% of our building sector emissions will be from new construction, meaning that by far the majority of our emissions will be from buildings that have already been built today. So it just shows that we need to address both existing and new buildings in any policy development. And then the second critical piece that we took away from this is that of the emission split between big buildings and small buildings, only 35% of those emissions will be from big buildings. So again, critical to address both big buildings and all of the small, largely residential buildings that we have in our city. And then finally, in this one, no surprise to anyone, and it's the same as in every other city essentially, we have a split between electricity and natural gas consumption currently. And in 2035, assuming no changes, except assuming that our electricity grid does get cleaner, as they are now legally mandated to do, the majority of the emissions from our building sector will be from natural gas. So again, critical that we tackle the electricity emissions and the natural gas emissions within the building sector. And so using these critical data points, we developed what I'm calling the three-legged stool plus of building sector decarbonization. And the interesting thing about this is that it is the same pathway that every other city has to take in order to achieve the decarbonization of the building sector that we know is critical. The key is not what we have to do, the key is how we have to do it. And that is the big challenge, and that is where the cities will differ and where some cities can come out and lead on other, on specific policies. So I'll quickly cover what this three-legged stool plus is. The first leg of the stool is energy efficiency. And this just, simply put, reduces the consumption of any energy in any form. And the key benefits of that are that it reduces energy demand, and which also reduces costs. I'll go into some of these a little bit more later. And then it allows for the use of smaller and thus cheaper systems to power our buildings, which is critical when we're renovating and also, of course, when we're building new buildings. The second key piece here is electrification. And this is really looking at that last chart, the natural gas chunk of the pie that was bigger than the electricity chunk of the pie. Electrification allows us to tackle that piece of the emissions. And the great thing about electrification is that the current systems that we use, the technology is ever improving, and they are more efficient than the most efficient natural gas systems. So electrification actually also reduces energy demand on top of energy efficiency. Then the third leg of the three-legged stool is renewable energy. And this is really getting at that other piece of the fuel pie, which is the electricity pie. So we know that our electricity grid is legally mandated to reduce to carbon-free by 2045. The two issues with that are that one, 2045 is after the target date that we were looking at. And then the second is, if we're doing this piece, if we're electrifying our buildings and also if we're electrifying our transit, which Rick will talk about, that's going to significantly increase the demand on the electricity grid, right? And they will be able to respond to some of that, but adding significant renewable energy resources to our building stock and then within our community in form of community solar and other things supports that increased demand and is critical. And then the plus piece of the stool is that none of this is going to be able to be doable within the time frame and for all the members of our community without significant financial and technical assistance. And I'll dive into this a bit more. And I clicked too soon, but just to go back. The reason that I'm calling it the Three-Legged Stool Plus, the key takeaway from that is that all of those pieces are critical together. We can't implement any one of those without implementing all of the others. They all interact with each other, they all tie into each other, they all ensure the success of each. And just like a stool, if you chop off one of those legs, the whole thing's gonna fall apart. So that is a big part of our chapter and has been made clear to council. So under the lens of that, these are the recommendations that we put forward. The first one, looking at energy efficiency, we recommended that for owner-occupied residential buildings that were built before 1990, they complete weatherization. And a similar proposal for renter-occupied buildings built before 1990. The reason that these are separated out is that the conditions of an owner-occupied building versus a renter-occupied building vary, of course. You know, the money and all of that is going to come from different sources. And so in the chapter, and I'll go into a little bit more, there are different recommendations based on that owner type. And the reason for the 1990 date is that buildings built after that are typically much more efficient because code has required them to be. And then for large commercial buildings, we are recommending energy upgrades and retro commissioning to ensure that those buildings are energy efficient. Again, I'll go into the details of this a bit more. For the electrification leg of the stool, we're recommending that for existing buildings, all existing buildings, when the space heating equipment and the water heating equipment dies, that equipment is replaced with that efficient electric equipment that I was talking about, the equipment that's more efficient than current natural gas appliances. And that for new construction, that all new buildings are simply built to be fully electric right now. Then for renewable energy, the third leg of the stool, we recommend that a pathway be created where building owners have 3 different options for helping to support the addition of renewable energy to our electricity grid. So the first is that an owner can install on-site solar. The second is that an owner can buy into community solar, given, you know, various criteria that might make on-site solar less desirable. And then the third, and this piece really ties into some of the energy supply recommendations, we recommend that the electric utility, either PSE or however the city moves forward with electric utilities, offer a green direct or similar program so that building owners can automatically be supporting the addition of renewable energy through the electric utility, and that be offered at no cost or a very low cost premium, ideally to everyone, but at least to low income residents. And so again, the recommendation is that owners choose one of these 3 pathways, each with their different benefits. And then finally, the financial and technical assistance plus piece of the stool. We recommend the creation of a technical assistance program, a City of Bellingham Clean Energy Fund, and a program to identify and promote additional financing sources. I'll go into some more details on this, and there's a lot more details in the report. Just a quick interlude. So I'm sure some of you are aware that there was a lot of conversation going on within the community about all of this as the process was happening, which is great because this is critical. We all have to be aware of you know, climate change is an issue, but then also what our city's role and pathway is going to be. And there were some misconceptions that came out of that. So to reiterate, just so we're all clear, the recommendations that we propose that council is just now considering would not require the installation of solar panels on all rooftops, would not require any update or replacement of existing roofs, would not require the installation of new windows, would not require the removal of existing gas stoves or fireplaces. You'll notice that for our existing building recommendations, we only recommended replacing space heating and water heating equipment when they die. And then none of these recommendations would have any impact on a building foundation, so you would never have to touch that. So we, of course, looked at these measures beyond carbon as well. Carbon was perhaps the critical lens. So some key components for each of the measure pathways, if we recommend them. For the energy efficiency, requirements, we recommend that no-cost pathways be established for low-income residents, and there are already existing programs in place in Bellingham for this, so that's essentially already done. I mentioned that the renter versus owner-occupied piece is critical. That's because of something we call the split incentive, where neither has the I'm not gonna go into it too much, but it's critical to make sure that this is addressed so that cost burdens don't get passed on to renters. And then finally, none of these requirements would be mandatory unless they were cost effective. So if they had a really short payback period. Um, for electrification, we recommend that the city or a cohort of cities in the area conduct a feasibility study on the incremental cost so that we can have a very specific understanding of how much financial resources would be required to support that. And then again, I've talked about this high efficiency piece right here. That piece is critical to making it work. Renewable energy, similar no cost, low cost pathways for low income residents, and a list of financing options that are already in place in various municipalities throughout the country that we could consider. And just a little note, one thing that I'm really excited about, even since we finished this work, I have seen a bunch of publicly owned utilities that are fully financing electrification of buildings for all of their residents. So no residents are faced with any upfront costs, and then the monthly costs are just added to their utility bill. And this is becoming a trend, and I think it's a pretty exciting way to look at doing this. And then quickly, the co-benefits. We already talked about a lot of these. Local job creation is a consistent co-benefit across. To me, the biggest electrification co-benefit that really I didn't fully understand the implications of until I dove into this research is that there are actually pretty significant community health and safety co-benefits from electrification. Natural gas combustion in our buildings has a pretty negative impact on air quality. It can increase asthma rates by up to 42%. It's cause of, I think, 1 in 4 fires after an earthquake from pipeline explosions. And so electrification really has this kind of immediate term positive benefit to our city beyond the climate implications, which I'm really excited about. And I'll skip that one, I think. And then for financing and technical assistance, this has the opportunity to bring a robust amount of new financial resources into our community, which is also pretty exciting. And I will stop and pass it to Rick.
After hearing that, I must say it was pleasing to me to, as part of this, this task force, to realize that the transportation portion was going to be much more straightforward. And I'll go through that. I'll go through why here in the next few minutes. So on the transportation portion, really we were looking at 4 things. We kind of broke our portion of the report down into 4 different segments. One is fuel electrification, so basically getting away from fossil fuels as a source of movement, of transportation, moving to electricity. One is mode shift, and this is something that the city of Bellingham has had goals for many, many years, for trying to encourage us, all of us, to use our cars less for single occupant trips and to walk, bike, car share, use transit, that type of thing more often. We also looked a lot at parking policy, and then had some suggestions to the city for how we might finance some of the measures that we're proposing. So I'm not going to go through, we had 21 measures, and I'm not going to go through each one. We're going to kind of break it down into segments here. But the bottom line is that, as the graph that Claire showed you, 32% of Bellingham's community emissions are transportation related. So transportation is 1/3 of the pie. And 99+% of the vehicle miles traveled in our city are with internal combustion engines as of today. Now, that's slowly changing as electric vehicles get more prevalent, but at the moment, it's still 99% of the vehicle miles traveled are with internal combustion engines. Therefore, it's pretty straightforward. If we want to seriously address the City Council's ambitions, we have to phase out internal combustion engines. It's really quite simple. What is not so simple in the transportation portion of this are the different measures to help facilitate that. But the bottom line of what we need to do as a community, as a globe, is pretty straightforward when it comes to transportation. And that should be done in conjunction with continuing on the mode share path. So still trying to reduce private vehicle trips. It would be nice to be able to deal with the carbon issue and reduce congestion at the same time, but really the carbon issue is primarily internal combustion engines. And you'll see that abbreviated as ICE vehicles. So the approach that will need to be taken. Now, I should have said this in the beginning, but as Claire said, or as David said, I recently retired from WTA, Whatcom Transportation Authority, 30 years there. And my last 15 years there was as the Director of Service Development. And part of my duties there were working at WTA or with the City of Bellingham, Western Washington University, the Whatcom Council of Governments, and others to try to deal with, to try to move that mode shift goal, to try to help us use incentives to encourage all of us to drive less and use alternatives more. So the first part of this slide touches on that. One thing I learned in spending 15 plus years on that is that incentives alone are not going to get us there, in my opinion, based on my professional experience. The single occupant vehicle reduction that we have seen from 2000 to 2014, so in that period of time, the best data that we have is that single occupant vehicle rates fell from just over 70% to just over 68%. The city's goal is to get that down to 50% by 2036. So in that 14-year time frame, it's about, within statistics, it's not even probably statistically significant in terms of the variation there. We've just scratched the surface, but it's all been incentive-based. By itself, that's not going to cut it. Disincentives alone aren't going to cut it either, again, in our opinion, because they're going to just feel punitive. And when people feel like they're being attacked, there's greater resistance. There's a pushback. So we can't do all one, we can't do all the other. It has to be both. So the measures that the transportation group came up with, we broke into 8 different sections, already touched on this. Transitioning to electricity as a fuel for most transportation. So of the measures in that, the first one is, very simply, we need to phase out internal combustion engines by 2035 if we're going to meet the City Council's ambition. So then the question is, okay, how do we do that? What are the incentives and disincentives that we can build into that to do that? And again, this would take probably an hour or so, literally, just to kind of go over each one. Don't have time for that. Encourage you to look at the report on the website. But a couple of the things I'll just touch on. One is number of cities, a number of countries actually around the world right now are not just looking at, but are actually getting to the point where they are saying we're no longer going to allow the sale of internal combustion engines by the end of 2030, 2035, different dates for different areas of the world. But that is a real thing, and that is one of the things we are proposing here, for example. Another one is in our opinion, we have to, as a community and as a city, we need to walk the talk. So especially coming from WTA, and WTA is already taking strong steps in this way, down this path, but we need to be able to show that the city as an entity and the WTA as an entity are also walking the talk, and not just expect the general public to do it. So we need to electrify the transit fleet, for example. We need to electrify the city's fleet, that type of thing. There's a lot more involved in all of those. So if there are questions on that, I'd be happy to go into more detail. The next set of measures have to do with meeting the city's existing mode share goals. I already mentioned this a little bit. The one area that we think probably has the greatest potential for maybe increasing the mode share for is bicycling. So we have a fair number of our measures that tap into trying to increase the incentives for bicycling. Reforming the city's parking policies. There are a number of ways in which we think that by making either parking more expensive or incentivizing electric vehicles when we're parking within the city, that we can both raise revenues and make internal combustion engine use less attractive. And then the last three measures have to do with potential funding sources, from the Transportation Benefit District to other potential funding sources that the city might consider. And again, could go into a lot more detail, but I'll keep going through here. So we'll get into a little bit of detail. Electric vehicles are 3 times as efficient as for converting energy into forward motion as fossil fuel vehicles. The vast majority of the energy created by burning diesel or burning gas is heat. Only about a quarter of it is to move the vehicle and the people forward. Electric vehicle options are growing rapidly. Many other cities and counties around the world are looking at eliminating internal combustion engines on either a portion or all of city streets. This is not, Bellingham has not created this. We are not the first to be looking at this. Especially a lot of the larger metropolitan areas around the world are seriously considering this right now. Bellingham is one of the smaller ones to be at least talking about it, but we did not invent this as an ambition. And then the last one there, if we're going to get moved to electric vehicles, we need far more charging stations, both at residences and at multi-family housing complexes. And the next set of measures have to do with the mode shift goals. Again, mentioned that biking, we think, has the greatest potential. We need a lot more education and encouragement on non-fossil fuel transportation. And our active transportation network, our bicycle and city master plans need to be speeded up if at all possible. Reforming city parking policies. One of the biggest things on this one is that right now, for folks that live in multifamily units, you're paying a certain amount for rent every month, whether you own a car or not. And part of your rent that you're paying is paying the developer for having developed parking spaces on that property in most cases. Whether you own a car or not, you're paying for that in your monthly rent. So unbundle that. Why don't we unbundle that so that when you pay rent, you're just paying your rent? And if you have a car and you want a parking space, you pay a separate payment for that. Unbundle it so that folks that don't own a car aren't subsidizing those who do. Potential ongoing funding streams. Again, we mentioned one, the Transportation Benefit District, which expires this year, that the city's taking a look at, but others. We're going to need, this is not going to be cheap to do. There's a lot of ways in which this is going to save us money, as Erin alluded to, but it's going to be a fair bit of upfront cost to get us there. And so that's really the trick, is we need to be able to find a way to agree to come up with some initial kind of infrastructure costs before the savings really start kicking in. So last slide. In conclusion, for transportation, this is really key. There is no technological reason why we can't meet the City Council's ambitions. The societal impediments to implementing these measures are substantial. So the commitment to facing those impediments must be equally substantial. Our whole political and economic system, which is based on consumption, based on competition and all of that, is something we're going to need to take a look at. This is not necessarily a measure, but it is a fact, I would say, that part of what is embedded in our society and our whole system are exacerbating or making it more difficult for us to deal with this problem. And so as a community, it's something we need to take a look at. We need to remember that the climate crisis is going to affect low-income persons more than the affluent. Affluent folks are going to have money for alternatives. Low-income folks, and we're seeing it already. We're seeing it in South Africa and many other parts of the world. This is a social justice issue along with an environmental issue. And then the last point was just, this was directed toward the City Council, but it applies to you folks too, thank you for listening and for being involved to whatever degree you can.
So there was a connection between transportation and land use. Land use has its own chapter, but the connection is that depending on how you develop your land in a city, you create transportation needs, you create transportation networks, and so the work group on transportation also included land use discussions, And the land use discussions recommendations came up with these three. That wasn't very articulate. And maximizing urban village zones. Bellingham has urban village designated areas now, and the task force working on this recognized that and thought that the best thing to do would be to maximize those however we can, create the permitting and the support that's needed to fill out those zones. And the same with the missing middle zones, which are the zones that transition between very dense zones and single-family residence. So it'd be the duplexes and the fourplexes and the 2 or 3 story apartment buildings. And then the last measure, which really doesn't directly reduce emissions, is to create pedestrian plazas, and this is to create car-free zones. The one that was suggested is on Railroad, for instance, down in the center of the city. And I'm going to move on quickly. And this is energy supply, and I'm going to move through this really quickly. If you have questions, you can either see me later or ask them at the time. Energy supply, we had 3 different categories: renewable energy, emerging technologies, and policy initiatives. Renewable energy, well, the context was that we recognized that the state had just passed what's called CETA, the Clean Energy Transition Act, and that was what someone referred to, the electric utilities will have to be 100% renewable sourced by 2045. We knew that. We looked at that. We looked at the existing energy demand, what it would take to turn that into clean energy. Looked at anticipated electric increases because of electrification in the building sector and the transportation sector, and looked at the capacity for creating new renewable energy. And then also the work of the task force was limited by the time, so we didn't conduct the detailed feasibility and cost analysis that it's going to require and that we will do in the future. And okay, that's not cool. Oh, there we go. Okay. I'm going to just tell you there are emerging technologies that we can use to increase our energy supply. I want to leave a little time for questions, and this is, so I'm going to scoot through this. Energy policy, there are a couple of instances, there are a couple of pieces of legislation in this session of the legislature that we're looking at supporting, and one of them is called PACER legislation. It's property assessed clean energy, where you can put the costs of your weatherization or energy efficiency or energy supply projects onto your tax bill, basically, and pay it over time. And that, what it does is it gets people over the hump of not having the resources to invest a lot in a big new project, but the energy savings over time pays them back for that. So if we can extend out the initial cost, they can receive that, they can pay off that cost as they receive the benefits. And I won't go through the rest of these. We've had 2 themes that were throughout the task force recommendations. One of them you've heard a lot about. All of the chapters had some recognition, some nod towards the need for funding, the need for increased funding in the community. I won't go into that, but if you're interested in the recommendations, please look at that as a holistic part, one of the themes of the recommendations. The other theme is education. All of the implementation actions are going to need education, either more research to fill out the measure itself, or education to the community to explain what the benefits are, what the costs are, and why we want to go ahead with these. So I just want to leave you with the fact that those themes are really important, and we can't underestimate or understate how important both of those are to the success of implementing a more robust, a more aggressive, more expedited climate action plan. This is the same slide we had earlier. I just want to reiterate that we are in a point where the council has received these recommendations. They're deliberating. They've already had 2 meetings, and they have another one scheduled. They have now formed a council climate committee, which will be meeting whenever the staff has something or whenever the council wants to take up an issue. So that's shows the commitment, I think, of our city government to taking this climate crisis seriously. and this is off script, but I just wanted to point out, the person I'm working for, the person that is going to feel the impact of whether we act or we don't act, just left a couple minutes ago. She was about, I don't know, this tall, maybe 5 or 6 years old, I'm not sure. But that's the person we need to work for. So, thank you.
All righty, thank you, all of our speakers today. Unlike our normal programs where we start with some questions from the program committee, we're going to open the floor to our badge-wearing members today, at least to start with, and take questions from the floor. We have Susan over here, and where's our second microphone? Okay, Michelle will be back there. So we'll start with some questions, and you can address them to any of the task force members, or if you have one about process, you can certainly ask me as well. So,
Well, we're not the folks. The city council and the mayor are the people that you need to direct your ambitions towards. So I think some of them have heard that right now. So thank you, Daniel. The County Climate Advisory Committee has taken that up. They've had several meetings that included experts from organizations in Seattle and the greater Seattle area about wind potential in Whatcom County and about the viability of wind in Whatcom County compared to the viability and the potential in eastern Washington and other places where they have continuous wind. So I think they have, I think they intend to take a suggested ordinance change to the county council, but I think they're going to complete their assessment and their inventory before they do that.
Yeah, that is critical, and it is my understanding, I'm not an expert in all of the technologies. It is my understanding that the technology already exists that doesn't, that allows heat pumps to not use those harmful greenhouse gas causing refrigerants. I don't have a great answer other than that the technology exists, and that if that technology is like any other technology, it will improve exponentially as well as getting cheaper exponentially. But it is something that certainly requires more awareness. So I'm glad you brought that up. Nope. That was something that was considered. It's something that's actually being considered and implemented, potentially implemented in other cities. It would allow for a different set of financing opportunities, but based on significant community input and conversation and recommendations, we changed it to at point of replacement, because that is the point where there's the least incremental upfront cost. Sure. Yeah, that would be awesome. And there are some utilities that allow for that and some utilities that don't. I'm not the right person to answer that question, but I will say just like there are utilities that are fully funding the upfront costs of electrification and efficiency, and then spreading that cost out over the utility bill over time, there are utilities that allow for that, and most of the utilities that do are publicly owned, not private investor owned like ours.
I'd actually like to address the net metering question, the concerning the solar and not being able to sell it back to the grid. If you're a PSC customer and you install solar on your home, you do get rebates back. You can sell it back to the grid. If you are not a PSC customer, regardless if you live in Whatcom County or Skagit County, you're probably serviced by the city of Blaine or the city of Sumas, but you're probably not a PSC customer if you live in those two cities. PSC customers can work through the net metering. If you install solar on your home, you can sell that back to us, and we will pay you a specific rate for whatever you do not use in your home. So I just want to make sure you all are aware of that. That's a program that we've had for many, many years.
Where buses are placed, where bus routes go, where bus stops go changes over time because the demographics change over time and the ridership patterns change over time. So we have heard this at WTA, we've heard this my whole career, that people buy houses, it's on a bus stop, it's on a bus route, and then sometime later it gets moved. Well, it gets moved because not very many people were riding it at that particular part of town or part of the county. And so it kind of gets to be a bit of a numbers game. So that's unfortunate. To get to your question, one thing we do have in this report is one of the recommendations is for us, for citizens of the city and the county to be able to help WTA afford to electrify the buses, because they're twice the cost, upfront cost, these electric buses. To help the city to afford them, WTA is primarily funded by sales tax, 0.6% sales tax. So one of our recommendations was for the city to consider supporting WTA and asking for an additional 1/10, from 6 to 7/10%. Some of that would go to bringing in electric buses faster, and some of that could go to additional service. So that's one area where one of our recommendations does touch on additional service. Whether or not it would go to your particular home, I don't know.
I haven't cleared this answer with anybody, but I would assume that if the smaller cities in the county approach the city administration with a request for assistance or for some kind of direction, that the administration would respond. And I mean, we could provide all of our information to them for sure, all of the research. I hadn't thought of that exact situation, but we are looking at how to take these measures forward and which ones to take forward soon and which ones to deliberate more on. And as we go through that process, I will be looking at those kinds of issues. The electric vehicle issue is something that's come up in the past, is waiting for the market to catch up with our aspirations. And as you saw one of the slides, there are going to be a lot more models supposedly coming online in 2020 and 2021. And hopefully those will be more attractive to a larger demographic, and it will up the EV sales. And as people wear out their EVs, they'll put them back on the used market, and it'll trickle down and people will be able to afford them. And hopefully we take those kinds of market considerations forward as we also look at how to increase EV traffic or EV use in the city and decrease ICE, internal combustion engine traffic in the city. It's a great point, because we can't take one of these forward, probably take there are some that we can take forward by themselves, but we can't take the whole package forward unless we take under consideration those kinds of synergies. We do have we're adding a climate manager position to the city pretty soon, and so we'll have some more resources and horsepower, that's an interesting. Anyway, we will have some more resources to work on implementing these strategies, so.
You know, I don't have a numerical answer for that. I would love to see studies, if they've been done, that try to look at the overall carbon footprint of ordering online, including the transportation of a product and the delivery and all of that, versus, you know, you or I going into town to buy what we need and making a trip out of that. I don't know. The bottom line is, though, I think that the more we can do multiple tasks on one trip, the fewer trips we take in general, especially if we're still in an internal combustion engine, the better. So the more we can group trips. Right now it is so convenient. Oh, I want a loaf of bread. I go get a loaf of bread. Then 2 hours later, I want to go, you know, to the library and drive to the library. And that convenience of just on the spot being able to do anything we want in a car, whether it's electric or internal combustion engine, is something that is unconscious. But that's one thing we can do to try to limit our carbon footprint now. The Amazons of the world and the folks that are delivering to our door, in some sense, it's nice, because they can make one round trip somewhere in the city or the county and drop off at dozens of different places. But on the other hand, I question personally whether or not that in the long run is going to be the way to go. If that is, because, again, I'm just reiterating, because we don't know what the overall carbon footprint is. And I just don't have an answer to that. I'm sorry, I'm rambling here, but if anybody knows of studies where they've looked at that, I'd be interested to know, but I don't know.
Well, I can probably address part of that. So the upfront financial costs of switching from natural gas to electric heat pump exist. And as, as each of us mentioned in our presentation, and as Claire reiterated at the end, a huge chunk of our research and of our proposals were significant financing sources, many of which currently exist that we could take advantage of. Helping consumers overcome that upfront cost is critical. And I did mention that one of the things that I'm most excited about is I've been seeing a lot of publicly owned utilities that are fully funding that upfront cost. This is happening in, I can't remember the city in California. It actually happens on Orcas Island. They have a really awesome website. There's one page, one form. You submit your HVAC bid, and they say, "Yep, we approve that that bid for your heat pump replacement," and then they pay for it. They put the financing, they pay that upfront cost, and then they charge you monthly for, I don't know, 10 years to 30 years. I think that's just right across the sound in Orcas Island, and that's just an example of the way that cities are dealing with that piece.
Free busing. Well, it's not free, no matter how. Busing, transit is going to be paid for one way or another. The question, what you mean, is whether or not it's free for the user as they're getting on the bus. I'm sure that's what you meant. Yes, so that is something that has been done, particularly at a couple smaller agencies. Island Transit for many years was a fare-free system, not totally anymore, but for small systems, oftentimes it can cost more to collect the fares than you actually get in fares. It doesn't pencil out. For larger transit systems, including WTA, it would be a loss of revenue from the fare box that would have to be made up for somewhere else, or the taxing authority would have to be increased in order to pay for that shortfall. It is true that when WTA has experimented with free fares for a day at a time or a week at a time, for example, over the years we've done that many times, we do see ridership go up, but generally it's short trips that go up a lot. So maybe somebody gets on the bus for 2 or 3 blocks that otherwise might have walked. We don't see a big jump in people when we do free fare that are coming longer distances that would have otherwise driven. Doesn't mean it doesn't mean it's zero, but it's not necessarily, I don't necessarily assume that if the system was free that we would see a big increase in ridership or a big decrease in the carbon footprint. It's only $1 a ride, for example, to ride WTA, and for the vast majority of people, the financial burden of riding transit is not a major factor in whether they ride or not.
Okay. All righty. Well, I wanted to thank you all for your questions and thank our 3 speakers here today.